So we're here with David Lappin and Dara O'Kearney, and the two hosts of the chip race. And coming up soon, I guess this Sunday, we're going to see the 10th anniversary. 10 years ago this weekend, Dara just told me. So tell me a little bit about the inception of the chip race. How do you two guys meet?
Yeah, well, I guess the relationships kind of like went through a couple of different phases. First of all, like I think in the early days, we had we quickly discovered we had a good synergy. We had very good characteristics relative to what the other person needed. David basically had no friends. He was a very abrasive character. Everybody hated him, and he tended to get into fights quite a lot.
That part's true. That part is true.
So my main function was to sort of like take the rough edges off him, and people would say, well, like, O'Kearney hangs out with him, so how bad can he really be? And I would also advise him, like, don't pick a fight with that guy. He's former head of the IRA, and don't pick a guy with that fight with that guy. He's like a gangster and so on. So because I knew all
these aren't hypotheticals, by the way. These are actual.
These are actual incidents. Yeah. I do remember at one tournament looking across, and David was having a very heated argument with a guy I knew to be a fairly high up in organized crime. And I was like, well, that's not good. So I told David at the break, like, you're going to have to like tone it down with that guy. It could actually be quite dangerous. And then at the next break, David was like, it's fine. It's all good. He's actually going to give me a lift home afterwards. And I was like, I'm not sure you want to do that. But yeah, but that was kind of my main thing for him. And then on the other hand, one of the problems I had was I was already fairly well known, and kind of everybody wanted to talk to me at breaks. So I wouldn't really get any break. And David was very good at just telling people to fuck off, which he's obviously still very good at, but
hasn't changed.
Yeah.
To rush us forward, we staked together for a while, so we had a little stable, kind of a boutique stable, I suppose, because it was only about maybe total 12 or 13 people.
Boutique. We were just staking a few friends. That's what it was.
Yeah, we were like, I think maybe 13 people.
Fancy word.
Boutique stable.
At any one time,
we sent people money. They played with it. They sent it back if we won. That was it. There was no boutique.
Yeah, kind of basic staking. So we did that for a while together, and then I think we were still maybe just about doing that around this time, or maybe we were.
We were for sure, because if
we
you remember,
towards the end of it, but
2015 was Clean's big year. So
okay, yeah, no, you're quite right. Sorry, we were still doing it for at least another year, and a friend of mine came to me and said, "Oh, are you interested in doing a podcast?" And I was like, "Not really." And
did he have to explain to you what a podcast was?
Probably, yeah. I probably didn't even know what a podcast was. And he basically explained that he was working for, this is my friend Rob, he was working for a company that did like a rugby and a cricket and a horse racing and different podcasts that were kind of sports adjacent. And one of the things they wanted to do, because I think maybe the owner of the company's son played a little bit of poker on the side, they liked the idea of having a poker one. Rob spoke up and said, I actually know, one of the guys who plays poker in Ireland and his friend, and they'd be kind of great for this. So I'll ask them for you. And Rob came to me, and I went to Dara, and we kind of thought it was an interesting idea, but we weren't really like, all in for it or anything. But we went and had a meeting, and it was a nice meeting, and it was in a nice studio, and they clearly had a good setup. So we thought, yeah, this is a good idea. Let's go away for a week and have a brainstorm about what the show would look like, or what it might sound like, or what it might be. And we liked the idea of shining the spotlight on Irish poker, because I guess there wasn't that at the time. So we conjured up this idea of a variety show that would sort of hit different parts of the industry and be in 5 parts, where you had maybe 3 or 4 different interviews over a show. And we went back and they liked us, and they said, okay. So we had a sound engineer and a media team and a studio, and it was all very nice. But we had to show up on a Monday morning, which wasn't great because we were poker players. But we kind of dragged ourselves out of bed for 7 weeks in a row and did it. And it was good. Like I listened back and you kind of cringe, obviously, because it's like a really early version of yourself broadcasting. But I guess we at least had enough about us that we thought it had some legs, and maybe enough delusion to think we didn't sound as bad as we did, that we get better. And we made those 7 shows, and our hope was that Paddy Power might sponsor us, who were the big Irish brand at the time. And literally the day the show ended, we found out that Paddy Power had basically decided they didn't care about poker anymore. So that was completely ballsed up. And it was a full year and a half later before we ended up being sponsored by Unibet. And we pitched the idea to them of let's bring back the podcast. And I was very motivated. Dara was locked in. We both had the deals, and that was great.
To be honest, David, I don't think we pitched it to them. I think we had already agreed that we were going to be ambassadors, and they were trying to think of stuff we could do. And I think
you're right.
Somebody just Googled us and they said, "Oh, you used to do this Irish podcast, and it was very popular." You could bring
it did go back and forth, but I remember being, whatever way it happened, I remember being very motivated because they had me twitching, and I fucking hated twitching. Yeah. And I thought, if this podcast works, they'll say I don't have to twitch anymore. So I was super motivated.
So what were some of the interesting guests that you remember from the very beginning, maybe the most bizarre situations that came up?
I do. Well, the most interesting thing I remember from the first season was we had on one of the guys that we were staking, Kevin Killeen, and Kevin had an amazing year. Basically, he chopped the Irish Open, he won Dublin UKIBT, and he was third in EPT London. So he was obviously a very good guest to get, and the fact that we staked him, we were able to twist his arm. He wasn't that keen, if truth be told. But then we went through the first interview, and it was okay. But the thing which really messed it up was David had kind of conceived that we were going to have this fun segment where we were going to ask him about old poker questions, kind of to show that like the modern new online kids knew nothing about the old guys. That I think that was kind of the theme. So the first time he did it, I think he got 2 out of 20. But then when he did it again, and we had already told him all the answers, surprise, surprise, he got all 20 right. So everybody afterwards going like, wow, Kevin really knows his stuff about all those old poker players from the 80s.
What's the best? Because it's like a highlight show. It's like watching Johnny Carson over the 30 years. Like, you had so many amazing moments, so many amazing guests, besides myself, of course, but and Andrew Lichtenberger on the same show. What's the best ever podcast moment that you think you both can? Maybe you both have two different memories, two different takes on that. You have a best moment ever?
There's a couple of ones for me. When we came back after 18 months, having just done one season of what was an Ireland only facing show, Unibet came to us and said, like, yeah, we want you to do it, but it can't be Ireland only facing. It has to be more global. And in fact, we want you to downplay the whole Irish thing because we don't even have a license in Ireland. You know, what they were doing, hiring 2 Irish ambassadors when they weren't even operating in Ireland, who knows? But I think they only figured this out afterwards. So we had to get international guests. And, you know, that's a lot more difficult than it looks, because when people look at a podcast, when you ask them to come on a podcast, the first thing they do is look at who's already been on. And if it's a bunch of Irish people they've never heard of, they're like, well, why would I go on that show? So we were kind of leaning on our friends. And actually in the first few shows back, we were just leaning on the other Unibet ambassadors. And the first person up was Ian Simpson.
Oh, yeah.
But David came up with a genius idea. It was like, well, nobody's going to be that interested in listening to Ian Simpson. Like, how interesting is Ian? So the best way to do this is we'll make it a really hostile interview. We will. So we'll start with a normal interview, kind of lull him in, make it, lull him into a false sense of security. Oh, this is just me chatting with the lads, with my new colleagues. And then halfway through, just the tone immediately shifts, and we just start relentlessly taking the piss out of him, asking him very difficult questions, making him very, very uncomfortable. We got permission from Unibet to do this, as I remember, in advance, because, you know, he was a Unibet ambassador, and we were like, we're kind of just going to rip him asunder, but it'll be more interesting than if we just do a regular interview, and it will get people talking and get people listening to the show. And they thought it was a great idea, but they insisted that they actually be there for the recording too, because they wanted to witness it in real time. So you can actually hear them in the background laughing during the Ian Simpson interview when suddenly the tone changes, because they all knew it was coming, and obviously Ian was the only poor puppy in the room who didn't know it was coming. So that was a personal highlight for me, just seeing us just complete Ian disintegrate into a puddle in front of our eyes. Well, I guess the real highlight for me will be when we got Jennifer Tilley on the show, because that, first of all, she gave us an amazing interview. She took time out of her busy schedule. She was originally, it was supposed to happen in Vegas, because I had known Jennifer for a few years, from when we were both writing for Card Player, and I asked her if she'd come on, and she said, much to my surprise, she said yeah, but she said it has to be done in person, because we never met in person, and so I said, okay, we'll do it during the WSOP. that year, unfortunately, her mother was ill and she had to leave the WSOP early, so it didn't happen. But she was still insistent it had to happen in person. So we arranged, she was in London promoting her latest Chucky film. And she was doing basically a day of interviews in a hotel room in London. And she said, I can get you guys on the list and just come along and do the interview. And she was such a trooper because when the film company found out who we were, they were like, they're not going on the list. There's some random poker podcast that doesn't have that much of a listenership. So she ended up doing it in her lunch hour, and giving us the whole hour as well. And she also delivered the most amazing, still my favorite line of all time. She was talking about playing, and we were chatting about what it was like playing tournaments. She had no idea who David was, clearly. So she turned to him at one stage and she goes, "Oh, do you play poker too, David?" Which kind of became a running joke in the show. We got
still is.
Yeah, it still is to this day. Yeah, very much so.
Yeah.
How about you, David? Favorite guest?
Look, a bit like what you said at the top, it is very hard because I guess we've done 400, 500 interviews at this point, and there have been so many great ones from not obvious sources too. Like we've had some great big name guests, Jason Coons, and people of that sort of like stature. We had a bizarre interview with Jungle Man, which was brilliant, but also genuinely bizarre. We had interviews with, but like Dan Smith's interview, Ike's interview, Steve O'Dwyer, who does very few interviews, came on the show. Obviously, Scott Seavers on the new show coming out in a couple of days, and he was absolutely brilliant as well. Annette O'Carroll, who was maybe the star of our 100th episode, even though we got Doug Polk for our 100th episode. Her interview was absolutely brilliant, and she's back for our celebratory 10th anniversary show as well, which is great, and gave an amazing sort of interview about poker down the years, I suppose, and sort of her wisdom and perspective from the point of view of an older Irish lady who's been in poker for 4 decades and all she's seen and the way the game has changed. Because Ireland is incredible for poker, really. Like after America, it's the first country that really adopted No Limit Hold'em and probably was playing most of the other variations before anyone else. Mm-hmm. So there's a huge tradition there, and she sort of witnessed it all. We had Donncha O'D, who's another Irish legend, who gave a similarly brilliant interview, looking back through all that time. So yeah, it's very hard to pick a favorite, but there are so many great ones, and also so many that are not from obvious sources. People like Tom Hall, Kat Arnsby are sort of regular returning guests. I'd say they've been probably back once a year, every year. And the reason we love them is because another part of the show that Dara and I are very proud of is, we fire our shots and we call it like we think it is. And even though we're obviously affiliated with Unibet, we've been given this independence from them. They don't really oversee what we do. They trust us to sort of put out a show that they think they're happy to have their name on. And we've been very lucky to have that lack of intervention from them, that we've been free to do what we wanted. And part and parcel of that is saying what we really think about poker. And people like Kat and Tom are also those kinds of people who will say very plain spokenly what their views are. And I think that's maybe in some sense at least an equal part to the strategy side that Dara takes the lead on, to the high stakes guys or online guys that people love to hear about. Right. I think that opinion guest is up there with those people for engaging people and making them think about what their views are on things. And I think that's been a big ingredient of the show.
Well, let's wrap up in a stellar way and talk a bit about what are you excited about the 10th anniversary show that's coming out on Sunday, I believe, right? Can you give us any sneak preview? What you're excited about and your feeling about it all coming up in a couple of days? Because this will come out more than likely the day before the show.
Yeah, well, Scott Seaver was on our wish list for a very long time, and we finally got him for the 10th anniversary, and he gave us an amazing interview. Definitely one of my favorites over the entire show. I kind of expected I would, because I had encountered Scott at the table a few times, and he always struck me as the kind of guy who was very honest and forthright, and also not an egomaniac. So he was likely to give us a very good interview. So I think that was a particularly good interview, and he's going to be the lead guest on the show.
Who else is on the show?
Yeah, to add to that, I guess there was a concept in mind with the show. It's a bumper episode. It's got one extra guest than we would normally do. We wanted the first half of the show to be Irish as a sort of nod to our Irish roots. 10 years ago, have been an Irish facing show, and to that aim, we got David Curtis, who is the sort of sponsorship guy now and marketing guy at PokerStars, who's been a friend of ours much longer than we even doing the podcast, a great pal of Dara's and mine, someone we've always bantered with and had fun with, even though we've been on different teams, if you like. But I think very much have a same vision of what poker should look like. We had Danny Maxwell on, somebody who I think I may have asked to come on the show more than any other human being. Danny is obviously a shy guy, a classic shy guy who wants to sort of, do his business quietly, take his photographs without much fuss. But he won the GPI award for best photo, having been nominated on 2 previous occasions. He was nominated a third time and finally won very deservedly. And it seemed like a great moment in time to get him on the show, and he was willing to do so. And then Annette O'Carroll comes back on for more pearls of wisdom. So that first half of the show is lovely. And then for strategy, right after the news, which, by the way, Barry did a great news piece for us as usual. But Tom Hall comes back, I think probably after Cat Arnsby, our most frequent guest on the show. And he seemed like, the right kind of person to have. We wanted to have familiar faces for not just this show, but shows around this period. We'd Cat on a recent show, looking to get Jen Shahade on maybe a show in a couple of episodes' time. People like that who've kind of been on time and time again, and who we love and are great friends of ours as well. So it gives us all the feels and all the sort of nostalgia and all the feeling of like just having been on a journey for all these years with this show and this concept. And I suppose in some ways, and again, classic callback here to the bromance stuff. This is nothing if not a partnership between Dara and I. We've had so many great collaborators: Ian Simpson, Barry, Dara Davey back in the day, loads of people who've helped behind the scenes, Willie Elliott, my partner Sharon. They've provided enormous amounts of support. But obviously the one continuity in the show is Dara and I. They're on every, segment that isn't the news together. And I think in many ways for people who've gone on that journey and listened to 10 years of shows, or at least dipped in from time to time over that time, will have seen a friendship grow, and will have seen a relationship and a working relationship and a partnership and a fidelity grow through all that period, which I think becomes maybe at least a subplot in the whole thing.
And Dara, anything to wrap up with?
Yeah, I mean, David has the ability to make everything sound gay, so he's put it up again. But yeah, we do have obviously poker guests, and we never wanted the show to be about us. We have friends who openly admit that the show is about their podcast is about them. Our podcast was never meant to be about us. But when you make as many episodes as we do, people obviously get to know us much better. We're much better known now than we were 10 years ago. 10 years ago, we were 2 fairly obscure Irish poker players, and we were genuinely surprised. I think we were walking to the show maybe on the 3rd or 4th one that we were going to do in the first season, and a guy neither of us had ever seen before literally stopped us on the street to tell us how much he enjoyed the show. And that was the first time we ever got a sort of a idea that it had a big impact. And just the way the show has grown down the years, from sort of being just a very niche Irish poker podcast to being something much more general, something apparently in the top 20 comedy podcasts in Germany, which we always get a kick out of. There must not be very many comedy podcasts in Germany. But it's as David said, it's been a very long journey, and it's funny how you remember things. Like when David put up that photo from the first show, I didn't remember that Dan Wilson was there, for example. I was like, what's Dan doing there? I did remember that we had interviewed him in the first season, and actually he gave us maybe the best interview of all in the first season, because he came up with a really great novel concept called Tournament Half-Life, which still stays with me with today. But yeah, I didn't remember that he was there right at the start. But yeah, like so many happy memories from the show. Obviously, at different times it was very challenging. Different times we thought it wouldn't work. When we came back the first 3 or 4 shows, got less and less and less views than the previous ones, and it just looked like the podcast was fading away. We've obviously had some very public spats with people down the years as well, much bigger names than ourselves, and survived that as well. So yeah, it's been a very positive experience, but there's certainly been enough challenging moments in there.
One thing I'd add as well, if you don't mind, Craig, is just how our sort of philosophy as well was, and we were very true to this all the way through. And actually, I give shout out to Fintan Hand, who gave me some good advice actually very early on. His Twitch career sort of started around the time our podcast career began. And he said to me, focus on getting a few new audience members every week, a handful each episode, and build it up organically. Don't do the big splashy stuff. That might come anyway, because you might weigh in on something which gets a lot of attention. You might have a guest who'll get you a lot of attention, but focus on the sort of the process of making the shows you want. And therefore people who come back will rely upon it being that product each time, and you'll grow an audience gradually. And I think when you look at the growth of the show, and Dara's absolutely right, we had a successful 7 episodes in a sort of smaller scale Irish context. We came back and it was going down, down, down. And we were kind of panicking a little bit at one point, or at least thinking, fuck, if it doesn't turn around soon, we're probably doomed. And we grafted and we stuck to our formula, but we found a few bigger name guests. We researched a bit harder for each interview. We managed to kind of, get out of that nosedive. And very much the pattern of the show has been, we picked up just audience share very incrementally all the time, every episode, to the point that we've reached today now where we are downloaded in 74 different countries. We have an audience I won't say a poor episode, because I don't ever call it a poor episode, but like a least popular episode in a batch will still get 17,000 listens, which is a huge number. You think about that, you think that's half a stadium. That's like, you go on stage every night for a quarter of that number. So we've always felt like we've gotten it to this point now where we have so many people from all over the world listening, and we're so proud of that. And we are just grafting away, trusting the sort of formula of the show, but always trying to, find new ways into it. And I think that has served us very well. I know people maybe, especially if they are infrequent listeners of the show, will only remember those spats or those big moments that we've had maybe down the years. But actually, it's much more been a journey of, 25 shows a year, sort of 23 of which probably didn't get headlines, but were really good shows.
Right. Well, I appreciate we have David Lappin, Dara O'Kearney, and excited to listen to the 10th anniversary of the chip race. Tune in this
It's a banger.
Sunday. Huh?
It's a banger.
Yeah, having literally just said that it doesn't matter when one show, we're all just going for consistency. And if you listen to his last thing, it was basically like, yeah, Finley gave me this great advice of like, don't try and go for big name guests. But then that didn't work. So but then we got a few big name guests.
And we got some big names as well.
So there was a real mixed message there, David. But yeah,
you're 2 big names for my show, so I appreciate you guys coming on board. And everybody, tune into the chip race this Sunday and check out those guys, and it should be a blast. And Scott Seaver is also one of my favorite players over the last 20 years. So enjoy. I appreciate your time, guys. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks a lot, Craig.
Thanks, Craig.